The sorry history of vaccination is littered with countless documented cases of debility and death that follow in its wake. As previously stated in Myth 5, just one example is the death of nearly half of all the Aboriginal children vaccinated in Australia's Northern Territories after one campaign to protect them from a disease they may never have encountered. Of course, if what happened there were to happen elsewhere, the link between vaccination, ill health and death would soon become obvious, and people would be up in arms refusing to have vaccinations themselves or to let their children be vaccinated. Paradoxically or counterintuitively, it is often the very individuals who didn't appear to react who may pay the price later in terms of chronic ill health. In this video, we will examine the issue of the effects upon the children and adults who have seemingly little or no adverse reaction to vaccines and so assume that they have been unaffected by any adverse consequences. However, most of what we think of as illness is detoxification, and many people's bodies will react to the injection of pathogens, toxic metals and carcinogenic chemicals by trying to rid the body of this toxic cocktail. This can commonly cause a fever, diarrhoea, cold or flu-like symptoms, and/or rashes. A very visible example is the skin reactions that can occur immediately after vaccination and which can continue for 7 or 8 years or may not appear until 1 to 6 years later. The experience of the military and the origins of Spanish flu. A particularly high proportion of military veterans of all stripes suffer a wide variety of chronic and degenerative illnesses in later life, including what is termed Gulf War syndrome. This is thought to be related, at least in part, to the sheer number of compulsory vaccinations that military personnel are given, and the fact that many different vaccines can be administered on the same day before deployment overseas. Although some people have an immediate and adverse reaction to the vaccines, possibly the vast majority display little or no overt untoward signs in the immediate aftermath, but go on to suffer intractable diseases in the decades that follow. In fact, it is possible that the infamous Spanish flu of the winter of 1918-19, which may have killed as many as 100 million people globally, originated with vaccinations given to the US military. It started at Camp Funston in Kansas when the troops were being vaccinated ready for deployment. US Army records show that 7 men dropped dead immediately after being vaccinated and that over 19,000 men were admitted into the Army hospitals suffering from anti-typhoid inoculation and vaccinia, that is, vaccine-related illnesses. Vaccines developed to suppress the symptoms caused by the typhoid vaccination had caused paratyphoid, and attempts to suppress that using vaccination resulted in what we now know as the Spanish flu. The soldiers not only shed the virus as they were deployed around the world, the US Army also imposed vaccination on native people, including over 10 million inhabitants of the Philippines. The American public, panicked by the prospect of infected returning soldiers at the end of the war, also clamoured to be vaccinated. At the time, the virus that caused the Spanish flu was unidentified and was only classified in 1933. The particular strain of virus involved in the Spanish flu outbreak has only ever appeared once again in the intervening century, and that was in 1976 at the US military base Fort Dix in New Jersey. This outbreak occurred after a round of what may have been experimental vaccinations, because it is important to note that Fort Dix was, and possibly still is, a vaccine trial centre. Unfortunately, the military make great subjects for such studies, since they are deemed to have given consent and can be covertly monitored and records kept of reactions before such vaccinations are released to the general public. Of course, the Spanish flu has been used as a justification for the recommendation of annual flu vaccination ever since, but may actually have been the cause. Another factor that may have played into the high fatality rate of the Spanish flu was aspirin poisoning. Manufactured by the German company Farbenfabriken Bayer from coal tar, there was also a large spike in the number of fatalities right after the US Surgeon General and the Journal of the American Medical Association recommended doses that are 25 times the amount considered safe today. In high doses, aspirin is known to cause pulmonary edema and may have contributed to the overall mortality rate of the pandemic. Aspirin was also used particularly enthusiastically on military bases. Big Pharma's sleight of hand. In the US in 1986, the vaccine manufacturers refused to accept further liability for the effects of their vaccines, products that have subsequently been determined in court to be unavoidably unsafe. Effectively holding the government to ransom, a fund known as the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, NCVIA, was established to compensate those who can prove to the satisfaction of the courts that they or their child have been harmed by the vaccination programme. As a consequence, the manufacturers are now only liable for reactions that occur within the first 3 days of vaccination, with the fund compensating the vast majority of cases for whom harm only becomes evident later. As a result of this imbroglio, the US also set up the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System in 1990, which receives approximately 11,000 reports of serious adverse effects to vaccinations every year, including many who are left disabled for a lifetime and typically between 1 and 200 deaths. The NCVIA fund, which is paid for by a tax levied on vaccinations, compensates only the most severe and proven cases of vaccine damage and conveniently does not cover deterioration of any pre-existing condition. The fund has awarded over $2.5 billion to over 3,500 victims of the vaccination programme, including over 1,100 people who have died as a consequence since its inception in 1986. And this, while 3/4 of claims that have been pursued as far as the courts are denied. So just to recap, the vaccine manufacturers have no financial incentive to fully research and test the safety and efficacy of their products because they have been given legal and financial immunity by a fund that actually added to their profitability. So the modus operandi is that the manufacturers launch each new vaccine in a blaze of publicity. Governments worldwide unquestioningly mandate the vaccine, when frankly the claims to prevent conditions such as obesity would be laughable were it not so serious. Then the NCVIA fund compensates those harmed, and most so compensated are subject to gagging orders as terms of their settlement, so cannot publicise the issue of the harm suffered. Vaccines cause and effect. Sometimes the link between vaccination and the harm done is obvious, or would be to any reasonable person, but even then the courts may decide that such reactions are just coincidental. This is allopathic medicine's favourite get-out clause for anything that they don't understand that is embarrassing or would make them liable or imply fault. For example, in 2006, a healthy UK toddler named George Fisher sickened the day after being vaccinated and died 10 days later. In 2008, a judge ruled that the reaction had happened, quotes, too soon to have been caused by the vaccine and that George had died of natural causes. As if the body doesn't mount an immediate challenge to having toxins and foreign proteins injected directly into the tissues and or blood. So there is an incredibly tiny time window in which adverse vaccine reactions have to manifest to be recognised in law, and this depends on the particular judge and country in which the harm occurred. Too soon or too delayed and the cause and effect link can be denied. Of course, this is crazy. This quote from John Rappaport. I've analysed this lie before and approached it from many angles. Here I'm going to keep things as simple as possible. Vaccines can and do cause damage. Neurological damage, brain damage. Parents of damaged children know this. They were there. They saw their children before vaccination and after vaccination. Everything else, and I mean everything, is diversion. High-class, sophisticated, deceptive, slimy, arrogant diversion. Vaccination in sickness and in health. The fact is that a great many people become ill to some greater or lesser extent after a vaccination, but they tolerate this, believing it to be the price paid for acquiring lifelong protection to a potentially dangerous pathogen. However, in Vaccination Myth 5, I explored the issue of whether vaccinations provide any protection at all, and if so, for how long. For a now retired nurse friend of mine, who was required to administer vaccinations in her professional capacity as matron of a geriatric ward, The link between giving the vaccines and the deaths of her elderly and presumably already sick patients over the following days and weeks was clearly, undeniably and repeatedly evident. Firstly, the adverse reactions many experience may involve contracting a hopefully mild dose of the disease being vaccinated against, and this may particularly be the case with the live virus vaccines such as measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, which is chickenpox, and influenza. Even if an adverse vaccine reaction occurs, most people will never remark upon it to a health professional. If they do, the health worker is most likely to dismiss it as coincidental or to reassure the patient. What they are least likely to do is file an official adverse reactions report. And the majority of those directly affected either won't realise that there is a procedure for registering such concerns or be motivated to pursue lodging a formal complaint. It is my guess that, for a variety of reasons, at least 99% of adverse reactions go unreported and unrecognised as being vaccine related. And so the juggernaut rolls on and the belief in the efficacy of vaccinations by the medical profession remains unchallenged. The genetic epidemic. A century ago, heart disease and cancer were rare, and yet now they will kill 1 in 3 of us each respectively. In the US, almost 3 million children have some form of learning disability and receive special education in school, and it is estimated that up to half the population may have an undiagnosed learning disability. In America in 1991, as few as 1 in every 2,500 children was diagnosed with autism, but that figure increased by 1,700% in just 1 decade to 2001, such that now at least 1 in every 88 children have the disease. Could this possibly be anything to do with the massive increase in the mandatory vaccination schedule that means that children in the US are required by the government to have 69 doses of 16 vaccines, exposing them to over 150 different antigens from the vaccine programme before the age of 18? And that is not to include all the other shots required for foreign travel, healthcare workers and annual flu shots which are recommended in order for you to supposedly be healthy. In California, the autism rate increased tenfold in the 20 years following the introduction of the MMR vaccine in the 1970s, and there was also a rapid increase in autism in the UK following the introduction of the MMR vaccine in the 1980s. The medical historian, researcher and author Dr. Harris Coulter, PhD, explained that his extensive research revealed childhood immunisation caused a low-grade encephalitis in between 15 and 20% of all infants. The many sequelae of autism, learning disabilities, seizures, epilepsy, asthma, cot death, obesity and impulsive disorders which plague modern society were rare until the advent of widespread and repeated vaccination. In addition, although some deaths attributed to shaken baby syndrome may have been caused by rough handling of a vulnerable baby, many may have been misdiagnosed cases of encephalitis caused by vaccination. This is madness, and no studies look at the effects of administering triple vaccines or several vaccinations on the same day, or the cumulative effect of repeated vaccination. When studies are done, they are typically done on otherwise healthy individuals and in isolation. Incredibly, allopathic medicine insists that the autism epidemic is largely genetic. It stretches credulity that they can believe that rather than questioning their practices, but that's another topic entirely. They literally can't see what they have been told doesn't exist, and the faith they place in the efficacy of vaccination remains unshaken. I do find it interesting, however, that many health workers either don't get vaccinated themselves, and in a recent study of Swiss doctors, up to 15% of non-paediatricians either delayed or refused vaccination for their own children. Just this one issue, the number of children on the autistic spectrum, is an absolute crisis. For the children, their families, for society, and for the chance to live a normal life the sufferers and their families have been denied. Vaccination Myth 7 continues in Part 2, which addresses the long-term effects of vaccine components.